I did bring a clock this week, so hopefully I will. I'm not promising that I will pay any attention to it, but I have one. Just to reemphasize what Zach said, if you guys do have questions, we're actually really looking forward to the chance to answer them. I don't know if that's off or on. All right. We did answer all your questions from last week, and it is uploading right now to our app, our YouTube channel, and tomorrow to our website. And then if you have questions from this week, instead of putting cards on your table and we're trying to figure out exactly what you wrote, you can just email your questions. So if you email to, questions, plural, questions@grace-bible.org. So you can just email them to me. I'm getting a lot of feedback. Do you guys want me to use the other mic? No, we're good? Okay. All right. Well, we have a lot to cover tonight. Last week we did 600 years. Tonight we're going to do 1100. So buckle up. It's really fun stuff, though. I love the material that we cover this week because for a lot of us, it's the one we know the least about. So we're going to talk about the medieval era and then the Reformation. And so really exciting stuff to cover. What I'd like to do real quick is open us up in prayer, and then we're going to review for a moment and then jump in to this new material. Heavenly Father, thank you so much that you are the God of history, that you are at work orchestrating all things for your glory and for our good. We praise you that you have been good and gracious and in control even when things were going crazy in the world. We thank you that you have worked over the last 2,000 years to bring the church to where it is now, and we know that you still have much in store for what you're going to do through the church and the world for your Son. We praise you and we thank you and we look forward to learning tonight together. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so let's review real quick. If you weren't here last week, the entire session from last week is online now, so you can go watch it. You have handouts at your table, but just to kind of remind you of some of this stuff that we talked about last week. Why do we study church history? 4 big reasons jump out to us. I'm sure there's more, but as I think about it, it humbles us. It helps us to remember that no church in the world today can claim to be the one authentic church from the first century. No church in the world today can claim to be doing church right and everyone else is doing church wrong. Instead, all of us come from a lot of different decisions that people have made over the last 2,000 years, and that helps us to have humility and to recognize we're not the one and only way to do church. It also warns us about how decisions we make today can have consequences that last for centuries and even millennia. It guides us as we study church history. It helps us to be able to spot fads and rehashed old heresies, and it helps just guide the direction of the decisions that we make. It helps us to be wise so that we don't remake mistakes from the past. And fourth and finally, it encourages us to see, despite all the mistakes that were made in the past in the church, God is continuing to move forward and do great things. So history is an incredibly useful subject. I guess I'm preaching to the choir because you all came back. So I'm glad that you value this and want to learn it. Few ground rules in case you weren't here last week, just to make sure we're clear on this. This is Protestant church history. Tonight I will get to the Reformation, and it will be very biased. You will be able to tell which side in that debate I favor because I'm Protestant. I can't help but present history through that lens. So if you're from a Roman Catholic background, or if you are Roman Catholic, you might disagree with how I present this material. That's okay. Every time someone presents history, it's going to be biased to some extent. This is how Protestants put the pieces together of church history. Another thing to remember, historical transition came gradually. We'll talk about in our lesson today the particular day when Martin Luther took his long list of grievances with the Roman Catholic Church and nailed them to the church door, and we all claim that that's when the Reformation started. Well, Martin Luther had no idea that. No one did. Just a monk put a piece of paper on a door. That's all that it was. It wasn't until much later that we look back and say, oh yeah, I guess we should probably write that date down, because that was kind of the hammer blow that started it all, but he didn't know. No one around him did. Third, doctrine only developed as need arose. Typically, the church was just trying to survive and follow Jesus in a difficult fallen world. They weren't sitting down and writing systematic theology books until heresies or threats forced them to. So just an important one to remember. Fourth, past leaders must be analyzed in their context. That's going to be really important tonight. We're going to see church leaders do some really good things, but also some really bad things. And it's easy for us to judge them and hate the things that they did, but we have to remember they lived in a world that was different than ours. Their context was different than ours. So we have to judge what they said in their context. We have to look at the questions they were asking and the way they were looking at the world, okay? So we got to analyze them in their own context. And then that last one, just a reminder, I'm not a historian. I really would prefer you not to stand up for me. There are great historians out there. I'm standing on their shoulders. I did not study history except in seminary, and I would point you to the books that I used. And so if you want to go deeper in this study, which will be really rewarding, I encourage you to do that. Just a reminder that these are the three sources I put up here last week. So Church History in Plain Language by Bruce Shelley, best one-volume book. It would make a great summer read. The Story of Christianity, 2 volumes by Gonzalez. That's my primary textbook that these notes come out of. Our Legacy, The History of Christian Doctrine by my professor, John Hanna, a great resource to help you understand how your particular beliefs developed over the history of the church. So lots of good stuff out there. Don't rely upon me to be the historian here. Turn to these guys who have done so much great research. All right, just a reminder of how we are thinking about the flow of church history over the last 2,000 years. I gave you this chart as a handout last week. And as we look at the 2,000 years from the beginning of the church in 33 AD, that's Pentecost, all the way up to today, there's these 4 big eras. Okay, the ancient church in blue that we studied last week, and we saw it has the apostolic age, church fathers, apologists, theologians. That's as far as we got last week, just the blue. Today, we will pick up in the medieval church era, which is a big chunk. It's all that red there, which includes the Catholic medieval and Roman Catholic medieval. We'll also enter into the modern era, which is the green there. Remember, modern in history doesn't mean the same thing it means in our common vernacular. It doesn't mean today. The modern era is 1500 to 1900 in Western history. Okay, so we'll look at the first part of that Reformation, and then we'll begin to look at the second part, the Enlightenment. We'll finish that next week and get into the final era that we're in the middle of, which is the postmodern era. We know the least about it because we're living in it. So we're still experiencing it. So that's the big flow of where we're going. Just to remind you of how the church, in a sense, as a body flows during this time period. I also gave you this chart last week. At the beginning of our study, 33 AD Pentecost, there is one church. It is united, and we call it Catholic. And Catholic is not at all the same thing as Roman Catholic. The word Catholic just means unified or one. It was one unified church. So everyone who was a Christian was part of one church. There was no concept of denominations or anything like that. That changed in 451 AD through the Council of Chalcedon, which we talked about last week, when the Ethiopic and Coptic church broke off. And they still exist today in places like Ethiopia and Egypt and some of the Middle East. They're just kind of living their own existence. We didn't talk much about them because I don't have time. Okay, so we're kind of focusing on the branch we come from. The second big divide we're going to look at tonight, 1054, the Great Schism. That's when the Eastern Orthodox Church split off. We're not going to talk much about them either. They have a rich history, a lot of amazing things. They still exist. They're massive, something like 78, 80 million believers in the world, particularly in Eastern Europe and Russia, those areas of the world. Fascinating history that we don't have time to look at. We're going to focus more on the top of the branches, and we're going to get tonight to Luther, 1517. That's when he nailed the piece of paper to the door, even though he didn't know what he was doing. That's when the Reformation officially kicks off, and we divide into the Protestant Church and the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, so as we look at this history lesson, we're going to stay primarily on the top bar all the way across because that's our branch that we belong to. Okay, so that's where we're going tonight. We're going to jump into the medieval church. I mentioned last week that when we think about the medieval church, remember it's not medieval, it's not like sinful. Medieval just means middle. It's the era of the church between the ancient church and the Reformation church. Now, the key is when you think about medieval, between the ancient church and the Reformation church, that means that you're talking about Western history, because there was no Reformation church in the Eastern world. So when we think about medieval church history, we're really focused on the church as it developed in Europe and North Africa, because that's the branch of the church that we came from. So tonight, that's where I'm going to focus our attention. There was lots going on that God was doing over in Asia, in the Middle East, in India, and China, and sub-Saharan Africa. There was lots going on that I don't have time to focus on. So just to remind us, we're focused on the history, the branch that most of us come out of. That's kind of where our focus is, but it's not to say that the church wasn't alive and doing things in other parts of the world. Okay, so we're going to look at medieval history now. When we think about medieval history, this is kind of how we tend to divide it up. So this is the medieval church, 600 to 1500 AD. It's divided in halves. Okay, so you have 600 to 1054. We call that the Catholic medieval church. Catholic because the East, which spoke Greek, and the West, which spoke Latin, were still unified. In this time, they hated each other, but they were still one during that time period. 1054, East and West split. So that's when Eastern Orthodox goes its own way, and we use a new label. We call that the Roman Catholic medieval era, when we're really focused on the Western branch, Latin-speaking branch of the church. Okay, so we're going to walk through these two halves. I've divided it, well, I can't take credit for this. This is scholars have divided it up into 5 sections, and the arrows are going up and down kind of to denote the fortunes of the church. So things can go bad, good, bad, good, bad. It kind of go up and down throughout this history. Okay, so if you're looking at your outlines, I'm just going to jump right in. We're going to start with kind of a bad period, not just for the church, but for the entire Western world. 600 to 750 AD, we kind of tag this with the collapse of Rome, collapse of the Roman Empire, even though it began much earlier. This is kind of where we're focused on the collapse of Rome as we enter into the early medieval age. So just to remind you from last week, long before this period, in the 300s, Constantine embraced Christianity, and then he moved the throne of the empire out of Rome and over to Constantinople. He founded, turned that city into a major city. It's now Istanbul. It's part of Turkey. So that's far to the east. So the throne of the kingdom moved to the east. And in the east, when you think about the eastern part of the world and the eastern part of the church, Constantine's kingdom actually lasted much longer there. So in the West, the Roman Empire falls, it collapses, but in the East, under a succession of empires, they entered what we call the Byzantine age, or the Byzantine Empire. It lasted for another 1,000 years until finally the Turks conquered it. Muslims came in and conquered it. So in the East, you still had a lot of imperial power. You still had a lot of political power. As a result, in the East, the church remained relatively weak and focused on spiritual things, because there was an emperor to take care of all that political stuff, all that economic stuff. Church just focused on the spiritual things, really, in the East. In the West, things were completely different. In the West, the world was collapsing. And so in the Western part, if you're familiar with any of the history, in the Western part of the Roman Empire, all those barbarian tribes that the Romans had kept at bay for centuries finally began to win. And they began to march south and to conquer the remnants of the Roman Empire. So you have the Visigoths, for example. They take Spain, they take northern Africa, and then they actually sack Rome in 410 AD, which absolutely shocked the world. The world could not fathom Rome falling. So 410 AD, eventually Rome is restored, but then it gets sacked again and conquered again and again by a succession of different barbarian tribes that would come in and conquer one another and conquer remnants of the Roman Empire and carve out land. So you have the Visigoths, followed by the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Goths, the Saxons, the Lombards. They just keep coming and keep wiping out what's left of the Western Roman Empire. So in this period of barbarians coming south and conquering and taking away all political stability, who's going to step up? Who is going to bring stability in the midst of all of that political, economic, military chaos? Well, it's going to be the church. So unlike in the East, where the church can just focus on spiritual things because you got a strong emperor, in the West, it's not that way. The political leadership has fallen apart. And so the church begins to step up during this era. It becomes the stabilizing force in Rome, and in three particular ways. So there's three ways that the church in Rome becomes a stabilizing force of Europe in this era. First of all, you have a gradual growth of the power of the Pope, the bishop of the Roman Church. Now, it's important to realize the word Pope, we think of the guy with the hat in Rome. Pope just meant father. That's all it meant. So actually, any bishop of a major church in the ancient church era could accurately be called Pope. He was just kind of the father of that church, watching over it. It's kind of a shepherding word. But eventually, Pope began to refer to the particular bishop of Rome. As that church began to step up and accrue more power. And so as these barbarian tribes invaded, the Pope in Rome, that bishop of Rome, began to accumulate more than just spiritual power in the world. And it began for really good motives. And so when you think about, okay, so who was the first bishop of Rome, leader of the church in Rome, who you could call a pope? And you mean kind of what it means today. Scholars disagree with each other, but we think probably it'd be Leo the Great. So Leo the Great was appointed pope or bishop in 440 AD. So it's a little bit still before this era. And Leo the Great, he was an interesting leader of the church. He did something amazing. Attila the Hun invaded. It's kind of the era of the world when Attila the Hun was doing his stuff. And he marches in Italy, and he's coming down upon Rome, and there are no political leaders with the courage to face him. The political government's just fallen apart. And so Leo says, all right, I'll go. And he goes, and he actually speaks with Attila the Hun and convinces him to go elsewhere and saves Rome. It happens again when the Vandals sack Rome in 455. They do take the city, but it's Leo who has the courage to step up and negotiate a surrender with them so that they don't burn the city and kill everyone inside. And so it's important to see Leo wasn't trying to accumulate political power for the church or for himself. It was just all of the secular leadership had fallen apart. And so he stepped up and said, I'll take my life into my hands and try to save people. And so that's what he did. And so Leo began to accumulate all of this power. So it began well. Unfortunately, power tends to corrupt. And so later on, Leo is going to begin to declare to the world that the church in Rome is the preeminent church. And so he's going to begin to claim that the leader of the Roman church is the leader of all of the church. So he's going to begin to claim Roman superiority. So he's kind of the first to start this spiritual combined with political power in the office of the Pope. Okay, that's a new day, a new dawn coming now that the leader of the church in Rome, in a lot of ways, carries as much political and military power as he does spiritual power. There's a number of popes after him, some good, some not, some powerful, some not. Next big guy who comes onto the scene is Gregory the Great. He is appointed Pope in 590 AD, so towards the beginning of the particular period that we're looking at. Fascinatingly, Gregory did not want to be Pope. He hated the idea, but they made him be Pope. And so when there was no other choice, he stepped up and said, okay. And as soon as they crowned him Pope, he gave it his all. He threw himself into it. At this time period, the political leadership of Rome was in absolute disarray. The city was literally crumbling and falling apart. And so Gregory stepped up and organized distribution of food. That's an economic activity. He rebuilt the aqueducts and defenses in the city. He raised an army and trained them. So now military power. And again, it's not because he wanted that power. It's because no one else would step up. And so he wanted to protect the people around him. When the Lombards came to sack Rome, he was the one who went out to meet them and negotiate peace with them. So he carries political power. He sent missionaries to the rest of the world, and we'll talk about this in a moment. Many of his missionaries had incredible success leading these barbarian tribes to Christ, and then they came under his spiritual leadership. He sent deputies throughout the world to resolve theological disputes. So the power of Rome as the theological arbitrator grows during his era. So he does a lot of great things politically and spiritually, but unfortunately, Gregory also gave in to a lot of the superstitious ideas that were prevalent in that part of the world at the time. And a lot of things entered into the faith in Gregory's time, things like purgatory and penance and the Mass as a re-sacrifice of Christ. So some of the things that we think of as that's Roman Catholic and different than what we hold to, it entered in this era. Okay, so he brought some of that in. Other though than those things, he kept Christianity pretty much like what you and I practice. In most ways, it stayed true to the apostles' doctrine. So, first big thing, the power of the Pope is growing. And again, we want to notice how history works. It began for very good reasons, very pure motives, but power tends to corrupt. Right? Okay, so second big thing that happened is Rome is becoming a stabilizing force. As I mentioned this, they sent missionaries to the barbarians. This is in a sense, the big missionary enterprise that we often think of in the Middle Ages. This is guys like Patrick, who goes to Ireland, and Boniface, who goes to Germany and leads whole tribes, whole groups of people to Jesus. Now, sometimes it was really beautiful, and it was missionary work, labor, leading people to Jesus. Sometimes it wasn't. They converted a king, and then the king forced all his people to become Christian at pain of death. So sometimes it was through military means, but it was very effective. Within a few hundred years, all of those tribes that had conquered the Roman Empire had in turn been conquered by the faith of the Roman Empire. In a few hundred years, that whole part of the world is Christian again, because these tribes have been won, these barbarian peoples. So we've got missionaries going to the barbarians. And the third, in this era, this is when you really have monastic orders or monasteries beginning. We talked last week about even before this era, how we had these kind of precursors to monks and nuns running off alone into the wilderness, maybe organizing a few of them together. But it's this era of world history where a lot of them band together and form monasteries for the first time. This is when Benedict came around and he wrote what's called the Rule. It laid out all of the rules of monastic life. And now why do monasteries matter? Well, monasteries become the instrument that preserves Western culture and history. When the rest of the world is burning, it's in the monasteries where manuscripts are being copied and knowledge is being preserved. In addition, it will be the monasteries where all of the future popes eventually will come from. That's kind of going to be the source of a lot of the political leadership and spiritual leadership of the church in the future. Okay, so we have monasteries bursting on the scene. So we've got a lot of bad things, 600 to 750 AD, but also some good things. Then the fortunes of the church and of Europe turn in the next era, era B. So this is the rise of the Carolingian dynasty. I know that's a weird word, but you should know it. It's really significant. Actually, the history of the church. There's a new challenge in the world, and it's Islam. So towards the end of our previous period, that's when Muhammad had his revelations and birthed this new religious movement in modern-day Saudi Arabia, so in the Middle East that we think of as Islam. He died long before it made its way to Europe, but his followers, his successors, built Islam into not just a spiritual force, but a political and military force as well. They succeeded in uniting Arab tribes and bringing many people groups that were originally very low on the power scale. They united them into a very powerful group that had great progress moving across North Africa and just claiming all of it. They claimed all of North Africa and then came into Spain and won Spain. And they were, at the end of that period, moving into the heart of Europe. And so what is the church and kind of Western Christendom going to do as Islam is threatening? It's actually coming both from the West and the East. Well, they can't turn to the Byzantine emperor because the Byzantine emperor has his own Islamic problem. He's got his own invasions to fight. And so the church looks around, and what they find is the most powerful barbarian tribe at this time, the Franks. And you think, Franks, French? Yes, it's that group of people who became what we think of as France. It wasn't France at that time. That's anachronistic. It wouldn't be France for a long, long time. The Franks were a barbarian group who were led to Christ in the, I think, late 400s, early 500, about 500. They conquered most of what we think of as France today, but for a long time they were kind of weak. There were a lot of different groups together. It wasn't until a guy named Charles Mantle, who we call the Hammer, united all of them into one big army, and he was the guy who, with all of that army of the Franks, finally went to war with the Moors, the Muslim invaders in Spain, and he won the first victory against the Muslim invasion. So he stopped the Islamic invasion in Spain, and as soon as he did that, everybody in Europe said basically, man, we will follow you. You ought to be the king. Now, he didn't really claim that authority, but his son, Pepin, did begin to claim the idea of king. And then Pepin's son, Charlemagne, went one further. And Charlemagne, that might be, I think I've heard the name Charlemagne before. Charlemagne was the greatest king in Europe in any of the Middle Ages. He was, in a sense, a return to an emperor. So Charlemagne, the grandson of Charles Mantel, he's crowned emperor by the Pope in 800 AD. So he has succeeded in unifying what we think of as Europe under a Christian banner, and he's crowned emperor by the Pope. What's really interesting, it's easy to say that and not think about the significance. When the Pope places a crown on his head, who is the more powerful person in the room? It's the Pope. The one who conveys or confers authority has more authority. So by placing the imperial crown on Charlemagne's head, and Charlemagne let him do it, the Pope is de facto saying, I'm the guy who chooses all political power on earth. So it was a power play, and it placed the church at the top rung of all political power on earth, in a sense. So Charlemagne is emperor. He's very, very successful as emperor. He's able to pull together a lot of the different tribes and even some that weren't Christian yet, like the Saxons. He brought them into the fold of Christianity. Again, it was through violence. He conquered them and told them, you either get baptized now or I kill you. So that was your choice. But they all entered into the church era. So in most people's mind, this is a high point in European society. You've got an emperor again, and he's uniting people. I do want to pause for a moment and fast forward like 1,000 years because it's fascinating. There's going to be an emperor about 1,000 years after Charlemagne, an emperor in France. And his name is, anybody know? Napoleon. Napoleon is going to be crowned emperor by who? Who will place the crown on Napoleon's head? Himself, very intentionally. He puts the crown on his own head. He actually enters the coronation room with it already on, like he did it in the bathroom. Boom, done. Because he knew, and for Napoleon, it was very intentional. He was saying, the church does not get to make me emperor. I make me emperor through my military conquests. So you can see that power play. Anytime that the church appointed someone king or queen or emperor, the church is the one with the highest power. Okay, so we have Charlemagne. In this era, this is kind of a high water mark for the church. They're very successful in the world. They're politically strong and respected. Theologically, they have some of these false beliefs, but mostly they believe what you believe. It's still fairly close to the apostles' doctrine. So we have a brief period of stability in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. It didn't last long. It was brief. We enter 900 to 1054. We enter into the collapse of the Carolingian dynasty. It collapses because he didn't have very strong descendants, and they fell apart. And his kingdom that he built, it fell apart. And it fell apart largely because of invasions. Again, there were Muslim invasions, but this is the era of the Viking invasions. And I don't know, I grew up always thinking that the Vikings were just like some little funny thing that they tell stories about. Actually, the Vikings were terrifying. And they were the scourge of Europe, not just from the north. They made it all the way into the Mediterranean basin. And because of the Viking scourge coming around all of the seafaring routes and the Muslim invasion coming from all landfaring routes, Europe was really threatened in this time. It was a time of great chaos and great violence. So we have these new invasions threatening from Europe, Vikings and Muslims. We also have the growth of corruption and injustice in the church. Why was that? Well, because as soon as the church becomes the ultimate political power, corruption must result. That's always how it works. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so for the church, how it played out, as the church became this instrument of political power on earth, that allowed the church to begin to accumulate land. In the medieval era, land was wealth. Land was everything, actually. And so as people died, they would often leave land to the church as kind of an act of spiritual devotion, hoping it helped them get out of purgatory quicker or do better in heaven, whatever it might be. And the church began to accumulate more and more land. And the more land it had, the more political power it had, the more economic power it had. And so after a while, when you think about, well, who are we going to appoint bishop? Well, who are the people who want the office? It's people who want money. It's people who want luxury. The position of bishop became more associated with earthly power and luxury than with any kind of spiritual responsibility. So bishop became, in a sense, like not just CEO, but like you were incredibly wealthy. You had incredible power. So as the bishop office begins to accumulate all this wealth and all this land, it also becomes for other people who get to choose the bishops another source of money, because what can you do? You can sell the office. We call that simony. Simony. Simony is when you sell a church office, and it became very common in this era. So who gets to be bishop? The highest bidder. Had nothing to do with spirituality or whether you were even really a Christian. It was just all about who paid the most money. In addition, this is before priestly celibacy. So if you get to be bishop, who do you want to be bishop after you? Your family, because now it's all about inheritance and wealth. And so that's what we think of with nepotism. So simony and nepotism become endemic in the church in this era. It becomes all about power and wealth in this era. So things are really ugly in this time period through simony and through nepotism. And then at the worst part, towards the end of this era, when things are just incredibly corrupt and incredibly awful, last thing that happens is the East splits from the West. It's kind of the sad end of this era. So the East splits from the West. We actually have a date there. It happened on a particular day, and everyone was aware of that particular day. It's July 16th, 1054. It had been building for a long time, so this was hundreds of years in coming. Why did the East split from the West? I guess the first reason is they talk different languages. And talking different languages leads to confusion and division. So in the East, they spoke Greek. In the West, they spoke Latin. It's just hard to work over a language barrier. And so that led to centuries of confusion. But the bigger issue was really what was happening in Rome with what the Pope was saying about his power. For the last few hundred years, the popes had been claiming more and more heavenly and earthly power. And so they began to claim that the bishop of Rome and the Roman church gets to call the shots for everybody. That was a claim that went 600 years back, and it just kept growing. Well, Eastern Church doesn't really like that. No one's going to sit down and hear that. They won't put up with it. And so that's ultimately what led to the split, is this power play with the West and Rome claiming preeminence over the entire church worldwide. There were a lot of other issues that they quoted at the time, things like Trinitarian definitions that got into minutia and icons in worship. If you go into Eastern Orthodox Church, you'll see lots of pictures that are like gold and leafed and all that kind of stuff. That's iconography, so that was an issue. And celibacy for priests, the West wanted, the East didn't. But those were all minor issues. It's really about power. That's what led to it. And so the East splits from the West, and they split. They mutually excommunicate each other. And since they both believed that salvation was only possible in the church, they mutually damned each other. So there was a moment in which the entire world was damned by their own confession. It's pretty crazy. So the East and the West split, and the East goes off on its own. And like I said, we're not going to cover them just because of lack of time, but really rich and wonderful history to study there on your own. We're going to focus on the West. And so we're entering a period of church history that we call the Roman Catholic medieval era, because now we're just focused on the Roman Catholic Church. We enter into a period of renewal because the last period was really bad. Things were horrible. There was incredible corruption going on in the church. We need renewal. The church knew that. The church could see it. Everybody knew, man, this simony, this nepotism, it's just awful. We got to do something about it. So there was a call for renewal, and it came out of the monasteries. So this place where all these monks are being trained. Monks were great to have be popes and bishops. Why? Because monks took a vow of poverty, so they can't care about all the land and the wealth, and they took a vow of celibacy. So they can't have kids. You can't have nepotism. So monks were immune, in a sense, to simony and nepotism. They couldn't give in to corruption. And so the church begins to call up the monks. We can trust you to lead us because you won't be corrupt. And so you have these monks step up and begin to lead the church. And as they lead the church, they're going to work in the church for a few big changes. So out of the monasteries, there's 3 big changes that come to the Roman Catholic Church. First of all, this is when you start to have enforced celibacy. So for some of you, maybe you grew up Roman Catholic, you thought, well, priests were always celibate. No, they weren't. They could be married and have kids before this. It wasn't until around this era that for the first time it's enforced. You must be celibate. And again, it's so hard because we look at that and say, why would you do that? Well, the initial idea was for a good reason, because when priests have kids, they end up getting into nepotism and all this ugly stuff. So let's just make them not have kids. So started for what could be arguably a good reason, but they're going to enforce celibacy. Second, they're going to adopt the absolute hierarchy of the monastery. What I mean by that is, I don't know how much you know about monasteries, but in a monastery, like one guy calls the shots. The abbot of the monastery tells all the monks what to do. And they have pledged their obedience. They must absolutely obey anything he tells them. Well, as the monks come into the papacy to be the pope, they bring that same idea of authority with them. And so they bring an absolute hierarchy to the church. So this is where you see the authority of the Pope go up even higher than it was. Now he is to be absolutely feared and obeyed above everything. And so at the height of this, it climaxes under a guy named Innocent III, who again came out of the monastic tradition, 1200 AD. He will actually claim, and people will support him in the claim, that the church has the greater sword. So the state has a sword, we have the bigger one. If I recall correctly, I think he said that basically the emperor and the pope, they are the 2 lights that God has given to govern the day and night. The pope is the sun, governing the greater day. And the emperor is the moon, governing the smaller night. And so you get the idea that basically he's claiming, yeah, the state and I both have authority, but mine trumps his. So this is when you have absolute authority vested in the Pope. So it climaxes under Innocent III, and that is what facilitates the launching of the Crusades. So the Crusades is, when we think about the Crusades, it's a very unusual thing to think about. The Crusades are armies being sent out, not from a nation. There's no emperor sending them out. It is the church. It is the church sending armies, because this is the era when the church had absolute power in every era, in every part of life. So the church launches a few hundred years of crusades, starts with Urban II calling the first crusade in 1095. There would be many crusades after that, 7, 8 crusades. When you think about the crusades, for a lot of us, we just think of them completely negative. There were some people who went off on the crusades for good motivations. They thought it was pleasing to God to reconquer the land of Jesus for the Christian church. They thought that was what God had called them to do. So there were many with good motivations, but there were some that didn't have good motivations and saw the Crusades as a mean to wealth or power. We do know that when the crusading army met the Muslim army, there was phenomenal violence by every side. And so I won't get into the details. Suffice it to say, when one religious group took a city, they just killed everyone. And I don't just mean like the men. I mean the women and the babies, everyone. There's unbelievable stories of incredible violence during this time period by both sides. Why did that happen? This is important to pause for a moment and recognize. No one in the Western world had a belief that you take for granted. The belief you take for granted is freedom of religion. People should be allowed to believe what they want without being killed for it. That idea didn't exist in the Western world, or any part of the world that we're talking about in this era. Everyone assumed you either believe the right thing, which is what I believe, or I have permission to kill you. And so they did. They killed anyone who disagreed with them. So interestingly, in the history of how that worked out, you've got crusading Christians killing Muslims, Muslims killing crusading Christians, and both of them killing the Jews. Any Jews found anywhere were just killed or burned or whatever it might be. So horrible time through this crusading issue, horrible on both sides. The Christians did succeed. The Crusaders succeeded in retaking Jerusalem for about 100 years and then lost it again. And as Islam united, they were divided at first. As they united into one powerful army, they kicked them out of Jerusalem and went all the way into Turkey, eventually took Istanbul or Constantinople over, and that whole part of the world became Muslim eventually. So, Crusades, really sad part of history. Finally, the last thing that this renewal out of the monastery brought is it began to move Christianity towards a system of works or a mechanical practice of the faith. And this is where Roman Catholic Christianity, we would say, again, I'm totally playing my cards here. I'm Protestant. So if you're Roman Catholic, you may hate what I'm about to say. Sorry, we disagree on this. This is when Roman Catholicism became a mechanical religion. And why was that? Well, it's actually really fascinating. It's not because any of these monks said, hey, let's turn Roman Catholicism into a list of things you have to do. They looked around at the world and they realized, first of all, no one has Bibles because it's really hard to print stuff. And second, even if they had Bibles, they couldn't read them because this is kind of the middle of the Middle Ages. Very few people can read. And if you can't read the Bible, how are you going to have a relationship with God? Because that's God's word. And so I guess you could say the monks kind of had a choice. You can either teach everyone to read, or you can just turn Christianity into a list of things you got to do. They chose what I would argue is the easier path. And so everything about the practice of Christianity becomes mechanical. You can actually see it in the architecture. If you go to churches built in this time period, you'll see beautiful stained glass windows. We love them, but do you know why they were made? Because no one in that church could read. And so that is how they experienced the stories, is through pictures. So rather than teaching them to read, they gave them pictures and they gave them things to do. So this is when Roman Catholicism began to really clearly teach that the way of salvation is through practicing the 7 sacraments. And you have to come to Mass. You have to practice confession to a priest. You can't relate to God because you can't read his word. So you got to go confess to a priest who can read his word. Again, they're just facing an illiterate world, but they choose the easy option instead of the hard option of teaching people to read. You can see why it's so important to teach literacy. Christianity depends on literacy because we're people of the book. Okay, so they chose the easy path, and as a result, Christianity moves towards a mechanical practice that we think of often today. So that's a monastic renewal. So doctrinally, it's not headed in good directions. There's a lot of things that are bad during this era. Militarily, bad. Evangelistically, bad. But the church is really strong during this era. However, that strength didn't last. The final part of the medieval age we call the late medieval decline. There's a number of things going on in this era. I'd explain them to you for a little bit. A lot of things that started in this era that you've taken for granted. You've never thought about life before these things. First is the birth of scholasticism in universities. So Texas A&M, we think of it going back a couple hundred years. The concept of university goes back to this era. So before this, you couldn't really talk about a university, unless you go back to like Greek and Roman ideas, different kind of sense there. But in the medieval world, in Europe, you didn't have universities until this era. So you have the birth of scholasticism and universities. They started out as cathedral schools, so there were schools in the churches and then grew and developed. And some of the great writers and theologians of this era, this is Thomas Aquinas, this is Anselm, this is Peter Abelard. They did a lot of great theological work. We wouldn't necessarily agree with all of it, but it was a lot of good work. But here's the problem that developed from scholasticism. These guys went so deep into theological minutia and complexity that in the world they lived, where everyone else was illiterate, there was no hope for the common man or woman understanding them. And so what it ended up doing is just emphasizing even more the division between the priest and the common practicer of the faith. Okay, so you have this scholasticism developed that led to an elite group of priests who understood God and could read his word and knew Thomas Aquinas. And then all the rest of us who couldn't hope to keep up because we couldn't even read, basically we were told, well, just do what that guy tells you and you're good. That's what you just got to do what he tells you. Okay, so we have the birth of scholasticism in universities, which, while it's good in some ways, is bad in others. Second, we have the papacy losing its power. The Pope begins to lose all of his political power. Why? Because something new bursts on the scene in the Western world in this era. Again, it's a concept you take for granted. It's the idea of a nation. Before this time period, no one thought of a nation. No one thought, so if you asked a typical person who lives in modern day France, who are you, what group do you belong to, he or she would say the town they live in. And that was their world. That was the whole world to them. Maybe they would think about kind of the county a little broader, but they had no concept of what we call a nation or France. That was completely foreign to them. But in this era, that begins to change. And people begin to think of themselves through the lens of a nation. They think of themselves as, hey, we have a big chunk of land with borders and distinct laws. This is when laws grow dramatically and bureaucracy in a good sense grows dramatically as governments come together and say, hey, we need to do some things and we need to provide some stability and we need to ward off chaos. And so you have the growth of this concept of nations. Well, here's the deal. When all you think of is yourself as a citizen of your town, there's no town that can stand up to a pope. So everybody just obeys the pope. But as soon as you begin to think of yourself as a citizen of a nation, well, a nation is big enough to stand up to a pope. And so that's the fundamental change that happens. The Pope loses his political power because it's now in the hands of these individual nations. And so that's a major change. Again, it doesn't happen overnight, but it begins to happen in this era. The result is that the papacy or the position of Pope actually goes from the one who's bestowing the crown to simply a political pawn. And so at the worst of this age, of this time period, there were actually 3 popes simultaneously, appointed by 3 different nation groups. And so they appointed who they wanted, and no pope, no one could figure out, well, who is actually the pope at this time? Depends if you ask France or Germany or who you talk to. So the political power of the papacy is in decline. In addition to that, the papacy fell back into corruption. Sadly, if you tell a guy, well, you can't get married, it doesn't mean he can't have sex. And so a lot of the bishops and a lot of the popes did. And they actually had concubines, and everybody knew it. And so they had lots of illegitimate children. That's not all of them, but that's many of them. And so there was a lot of immorality. In addition, there was a lot of corruption over money again. Again, every time you have a spiritual office combined with political and military power, you're going to end up having corruption over money. And so this is an era when we think of kind of the Renaissance popes. We'll talk about the Renaissance in a moment, but trying to build Italy and particularly the Vatican into this ornate, beautiful place. Well, a lot of it, I don't know if they were even Christians for a lot of these guys. They cared nothing about spirituality. They cared only about luxury and beauty. So you have a lot of corruption during this era. Actually, I should mention the worst of that corruption was actually the Cathedral of Peter, St. Peter's in the middle of the Vatican. That was built using an economic tool called indulgences. So the Pope's political power had waned. However, he could always tell common people, if you want to go to heaven, you must pay, and he did. And so this is kind of the era when they began to sell indulgences. And so he would send representatives out. And typically they would talk less about like you buying your salvation, but more about you buying a dead loved one's salvation. So they would talk about how as soon as your coin drops into the cup, a soul from purgatory springs. And so you can set your dead relative free from purgatory by giving money to the church. Well, that's obviously false, but it makes a lot of money. So that's how St. Peter's was built. Kind of sad if you visit it and realize it was built through a horrific lie. But it worked. So raised a lot of money that way. So lots of corruption in the church at this era. Oops, skipped one. Towards the end of this era, when corruption was at its worst, this is when we begin to have serious calls for reform. So, I mean, it's just awful. The church there's so much awful things going on. You have people, though, within the church calling out, crying out for reform. So you have John Wycliffe in England, who translates the Bible into English, which was against the law. The Pope would not allow that because it ceded control to other people. So he translates it and he calls for a practice of Christianity that goes back to the early days, back to the Bible. You have John Huss in Bohemia. He picks up John Wycliffe's writings and he begins to spread that idea of let's return to what the New Testament taught us. Let's move away from the mechanical practice of the faith and indulgences and corruption. But the church still had enough political power to burn John Huss at the stake. So they still had enough power to enforce their way. In addition to calls for reform in the church, you also have calls for reform outside the church or in the world in general. We call that the Renaissance. The Renaissance is a movement among the intellectual in this era of world history, and it was actually precipitated in a very unusual way. It's when the Turks won, and they kicked all the scholars who were still in the eastern part of the Byzantine Empire. They kicked them out of Istanbul. And those guys, when they came, they brought their manuscripts with them. They brought their books with them, and they came to the West, and they came to Rome, and they began to teach people, hey, there's a lot you don't know. There's a lot of history you don't know. And so we have a recovery of Greek and Roman philosophy and history. We have a resurgence of art and science, an incredible amount of intellectual growth that came out of the loss of the Byzantine Empire. And as they come into the Western world, they're the ones who begin to say, guys, maybe we should stop killing each other over all of this stuff. Maybe we should think differently. So you have a lot of calls for reform. The church isn't interested. And it still has enough political power to be able to put to death anyone they don't like. Okay, so that is the end of the medieval era because something is about to happen. That whole indulgence thing, it makes its way to Germany. And there's a particular guy who goes to Germany and sells indulgences in the hearing of a monk named Luther. And that's going to be what tips the scales for Luther. And he is ready to launch the Reformation, particularly over the sale of indulgences. That's the linchpin issue. So let's move into the Reformation era. I know we're covering a lot tonight. You guys are doing great. The Reformation era, there's a misnomer here. It's not Reformation. It's Reformations, plural. There were actually many Reformations. We'll talk about them. Those Reformations led to 3 distinct groups in the Western Church. The key, though, is to notice Western Church. So if you know somebody who's Eastern Orthodox, they didn't experience a Reformation. That didn't happen for them. If you know someone who's a Coptic believer, they didn't have a Reformation. It's just the Western Church, Roman Catholic Church, that went through a Reformation. So there's Reformations, multiple streams happening at the same time. These multiple Reformations will lead to 2 basic groups of Protestant Reformed denominations and 1 renewed Roman Catholic Church. So I want to talk about both of those. Obviously, I'm playing my cards here as a Protestant. We believe that this is when the apostles' doctrine was recovered by the Protestant church. This is when we believe people succeeded in bringing us back to a simple practice of New Testament faith. Obviously, if you're Roman Catholic, you disagree with that assessment. But here's the bad news. This is still before the era of the concept of freedom of religion. And so when we think about the Reformations, it was not this grand time of, hey, let me lead you as an individual to understand the Bible and you can walk with Jesus. No, you're a common person. You will practice whatever your king tells you. And so this is still an era when you as a common person had to practice the faith of your ruler or you were killed. It was also still the era when people killed each other over religion. And so all 3 of those groups, the Protestants and the Catholics, they killed each other in millions, literally millions of people. There's a 30 Years' War that was the height of it. 8 million people died. It was a third of modern day Germany was wiped out by religious war between Catholics and Protestants. There were even Protestants who killed other Protestants over disagreement because, again, no one had the idea of let you believe what you want to believe. So you will believe what I tell you to believe or I'll kill you. Okay, so we're still in that era, and phenomenal amount of bloodshed in Europe during this era. So let's talk about these different branches of the Reformation. Let's start with the Protestants. So when I say there's 2 basic groups of Protestant reformations, the first big group of Protestant reformers we call the magisterial Protestants, which is a fancy word. Magisterial just means church and state united. These are the reformers who we would say reformed basic doctrine about the Bible and about salvation and about things of that nature, but they did not change what the Catholic Church said about the unity of church and state and the church wielding the sword. Okay, so these reformers, again, so when we're about to talk about Lutheran and Luther would tell you, you must believe Luther. You must practice Lutheranism or they're going to kill you. Okay, so again, church and state are united and these ones. So we're going to talk about 3 different denominations that come out of the magisterial Protestants, each one in a different geography or different area of Europe. So we'll start with Germany, which at the time was still called the Holy Roman Empire, even though it's kind of what we think of today as Germany. This is where the Lutheran Church is birthed. And so let's talk for a moment about Luther. Zach mentioned earlier the movie Luther. If you haven't seen Luther, you should. That's like your homework this week. Awesome movie, and you should know that history because it really affects you and how you practice your faith. So wonderful movie, really fun to read or watch. So Martin Luther actually started out as a Roman Catholic monk. He became a monk, not initially by choice. He didn't want to be. And then he was caught one day in a thunderstorm out in a field and was absolutely terrified that he was going to die. And he told God, if you let me live, I'll be a monk. And he lived. And so he became a monk and he entered into the Roman Catholic Church and he progressed from monk to a very successful and famous theology professor within the Roman Catholic Church. But Luther was haunted by a sense of doubt. Absolutely haunted, or not doubt, guilt. He could not get over the fear that God would punish him for his sin. So he couldn't escape that. So he uses everything that Roman Catholicism will give him, every tool, every passage, every teaching, trying to escape from guilt. But the more he dives deeper into Roman Catholicism and sees that it's all about what you do, the more he realizes, I'm never doing enough. And so he would actually ask his abbot for extra duties. Like, give me more stuff to do because I can't get rid of this feeling of guilt inside of me. And so just desperate to escape guilt, Luther ends up turning to the book of Romans. And it's the book of Romans that we would say transforms Luther. Because in Romans, he discovers that God doesn't present salvation as a product of works. He presents it as a gift earned by the righteousness of Jesus. And that's what's transformative to Luther is, wait a minute, it's not about what I do, it's about what Jesus did. And that changes everything for him. And so Luther embraces this idea of it's all through faith alone and Jesus alone as my Savior. And his initial goal is, well, let me help the Roman Catholics around me to recover that truth. He wants to reform the church within the church. But the more time that goes on, the more he sees, man, there's some things going on in the Roman Catholic Church from the Pope that work against salvation by faith alone. And again, what's the one that really stands out? Indulgences. You're telling people that to be saved, they got to give you money? That completely runs contrary to salvation by grace alone. And so, fed up, Luther lists out 95 things he disagrees with. It's 95 theses that he writes out, writes it on paper, and he nails it to a door in the church of Wittenberg. More significantly, he also mails it to a bishop, which is the guy who actually reads it. And his hope is that the church will actually say, hey, you got a point there. That's not bad. The bishop forwards it to the Pope in Rome. Well, how do you think the Pope in Rome feels? Man, he doesn't care about spiritual stuff. He wants to build St. Peter's. And so he excommunicates Luther. It takes a while. First, they're going to try him and try to figure it out. But eventually, it's going to lead to excommunication. Now, if Luther had been born 50 years or 100 years earlier, that'd be it. He'd be burned. You wouldn't know his name because the church 50 or 100 years before that still had the power to put to death anyone it didn't like. Luther was born at the perfect time because of 2 innovations. First, we've already talked about the innovation of the nation. Luther lived in an area of Germany where the prince, who was his leader, thought of himself as the leader of an actual geographic area with political power that the Pope in Rome can't push around. So his prince was willing to say, I don't care what the Pope says about you. I am your leader. I'm going to call the shots. Second innovation, really interesting. It's a technological one. The printing press. The printing press changed the world more than Luther did because the printing press allowed Luther's books to be published, particularly his translation of the Bible into German, which no one had done. That was illegal. When he wrote it in German, guess what the Germans could finally do? Read Romans. They read Romans and they realized, wait a minute, Luther's right, the Pope's wrong. And so because of this, in a sense, almost accident of history, although God is sovereign, so he planned it all out, that we now have nations and we have a printing press, Luther's not burned. He's allowed to live, and it's kind of dicey for a while. Watch the movie, it's fascinating. But he lives through it, and he ends up succeeding in giving birth to what we call Lutheranism. And his follower, his protege, Melanchthon, writes it all out. He's the guy who systematized it, and Lutheranism as a religion takes off. For a while, it's not the religion of Germany, it's the religion of provinces of Germany where the prince of that province likes what Luther's saying. So for a long time, what you think of as Germany was both Catholic and Lutheran. It just depended on what county you lived in. And if you had the misfortune of moving to a county that didn't agree with you religiously, they'd just kill you. It was awful. Okay, so that's how Lutheranism spread. So we got Lutheranism in Germany. How about Switzerland and parts of France? Different Reformation. It led to what we call the Reformed Church. It was birthed by a guy named Zwingli, who you probably never heard of. He's actually just like Luther. Had a personality very similar to Luther. Actually, fascinating bit of history. Luther and Zwingli met together at one point to try to decide, can we unite our movements so that there's kind of one Reformed church in all of Germany and Switzerland and France? Turns out both guys were just really stubborn. And they could not unify, and it was over some ridiculous deal with how exactly do you interpret John 6 and the metaphors that Jesus used. They just, no, we're done. So they walked away from each other. But you end up with two different branches of this magisterial Reformation. So you have the Reformed Church. Interesting, with Lutheranism, we call it Lutheranism after the founder. With the Reformed Church, we typically call it Calvinism. And Calvin wasn't the guy who birthed it. It was Zwingli. Calvin was his protege. Calvin happened to be a very gifted writer. And so he wrote down what you think of as the Reformed faith in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, which became very famous, spread throughout the world. What's interesting, if you happen to have followed the debate at all, you know that when you think of Calvinism, you think of there's a theological opposite of Calvinism, which is Arminianism. Actually, both of them are Calvinist. So Calvin did not make you choose between the free will of humans and the divine sovereignty of God. He put them both on the page. They're both there in his Institutes. It's not till his followers read that and say, well, you can't have both of those. And some of them pick sovereignty and some pick free will. And that was the divide. So actually, both Calvinism and Arminianism are Calvin. They're just choosing one part of Calvin. Calvin, actually, I would say, agrees with us that you have to have both on the page. You don't get to pick. So interesting little bit of history there. So you have the Reformed Church, Zwingli and John Calvin. You have a third magisterial Protestant Reformation, and that's in England. So England, fascinating what's happening in England. England is going to give birth to the Anglican Church. In America, we call it the Episcopalian Church. It's the same thing. The Americans just didn't want to use the word Anglican, so they gave it its own name, because that's what Americans do. But it's the same church. So in England, again, fascinating history. How did the Anglican Church come about? Well, it's actually because a guy wanted a divorce. Or he wanted annulment. We're talking about Henry VIII. So if you ever studied that history, Henry VIII wanted the Pope to annul his marriage, and it's long, complex history. Pope says no, and so Henry VIII says goodbye, because again, we're in the era of nationalism. So Henry VIII thinks of England as its own thing. I don't have to do what the Pope says. We are our own nation. We can push back. So he pushes back. He has his parliament actually declare that he, as king, is head of the church in England. So the church in England politically divides from Rome, but it remains Roman Catholic in doctrine and practice for a couple more generations. There's a couple generations where you got kind of Protestantism coming in, Roman Catholics fighting back, a lot of bloodshed, until Elizabeth comes to the throne. So the famous Elizabeth, who ruled for an incredibly long time, the Elizabethan age, she is just a brilliant politician. Really, really wise woman. She comes up with what we call the middle way. That's what Anglicanism is. So Anglicanism takes the doctrine of the Protestants and all of the trappings and ceremony of the Catholics and puts them together. That's Anglicanism for you. So are Anglicans Protestants? Yes in doctrine, no in looks. Okay, so very successful middle way. Not everyone liked it. There were still plenty of Reformed folks, particularly Calvinists in England, who disagreed, and so there were some more fights over that. Eventually, the Calvinists just got really angry and left for America. So that's Puritans. That's where those folks come from. They were tired of the compromise of the Anglican Church. Basically, even though Anglicanism was this brilliant political compromise, no one liked it. Like the popes, they hated it because you gave up our doctrine, and the Reformed Protestants hated it because you still look Roman Catholic, and so all those folks just left, and England went Anglican. So that's your magisterial Protestants, 3 different branches, 3 different reformations, all happening in different places throughout Europe. In addition, you have something else. You have the radical Protestants. The radical Protestants go further than the magisterial Protestants. The radical Protestants say, hey, if we're going to go all the way back to what the Bible says, then we need to recognize that in the Bible, the New Testament talks about a spiritual people not wielding political and military power. And so they divide the church and the state. Well, we call them the Anabaptists. Because as they went back to the New Testament, what they realized is that if all we're going to do is read the New Testament and adopt what it says, we don't see babies being baptized. We see believers being baptized. And so the Anabaptists say, well, I was baptized as a baby, but not as a believer. I need to do what the New Testament says. And so they would baptize themselves a second time. So that's why they're called Anabaptists, baptize again. No one liked them. The Reformed folks, the Lutheran folks, and the Catholics killed them just anywhere they were. And they never had military power to fight back. Because why? Their basic theological belief that church and state are separate. So they couldn't raise an army. So they got killed by everybody. The most famous way of killing them was you just baptize them until they drowned. So you just hold them down. There's actually, it says that there's woodcuts, like pictures of Protestants drowning Anabaptists. It's like, you want to get baptized again? We'll help you. So Anabaptists were persecuted by everybody. They wanted to return to the simple Christianity of the New Testament. They ended up spreading in small numbers throughout Holland, England, and America. And you can probably guess what they're called today. You just drop the Anna. These are the Baptists. This is where you come from if you're part of Grace Bible Church. So Grace Bible Church was born as a Baptist church. So we are Anabaptists. You are a radical Protestant. So welcome to the club. It's good to be radical Protestants. So this is our branch of the church. So you have the radical Protestants. And then there's a third Reformation going on at the same time, and it's the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation. So within the Roman Catholic Church, there was a movement towards reform actually before Luther. Because people knew all this corruption and immorality, it's gross. We got to do something about it. And so there was a counter-reformation, but as you can guess, it was a reform of practice, not doctrine. So they're not going to change their doctrinal beliefs, they're just going to root out corruption. And so the Roman Catholic Church was actually quite successful at this. A lot of the awful immorality and corruption of the late medieval era was stamped out and removed. And there really was a return to more pure practice, but there weren't any changes in doctrine. So this is famously codified at the Council of Trent, which happened after Luther. It was in response to Protestantism. The Roman Catholic Church said, okay, so the Protestants are breaking out everywhere. We need to get together and we need to write down exactly what is Christianity. And they did at the Council of Trent. They codified modern day Roman Catholicism. So for most people, when they say, what do Roman Catholics believe? That's where I point them. That's where you'll see it more than anywhere else, is in the Council of Trent. That is Roman Catholicism as you and I know it. So they codified Roman Catholicism, and then they damned all the Protestants. And the Protestants damned all them. So again, just everybody anathematizing one another. In this era, you have all 3 of these different branches of the Reformation, all 3 heading in different directions and killing one another. And so on the continent of Europe, there's just a phenomenal amount of bloodshed and violence and chaos and fear in this era. And because of that, there begins to be a movement, particularly among intellectuals of the day, saying it is time for us to stop killing one another over religion. And that idea will give birth to the next era of church history, which I'm going to introduce to you, and then we'll finish next week. So all I can do right now is introduce you. The next thing, I forgot the Inquisition. Yeah, Roman Catholic Church launched the Inquisition. So again, violence. Inquisition used like judicial system, like courts and laws and imprisonment and torture and execution to enforce Roman Catholicism. Super ugly. So you can go read about that if you really want to. All right, so next era. All of this bloodshed and violence gives birth to a new movement in Western thought that we call the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, again, there's no easy date, like here's the exact date that it began, but we date it roughly to about 1700, leading up to about 1900 is the era of the Enlightenment. You've probably heard that phrase before, Enlightenment. What does it actually mean? The Enlightenment refers to an intellectual and philosophical movement in the West. This is so important. What we're going to talk about in the Enlightenment did not happen in the Middle East or Asia or sub-Saharan Africa or it didn't happen in the same way. Okay, so we're focused on one particular area of the world. It's an intellectual and philosophical movement in the West that relied on human reason rather than revelation as source of truth and progress. Human reason rather than revelation as source of truth and progress. Its seeds or roots go back to the Renaissance, obviously. The Renaissance said, hey, let's return to study and to learning. Let's learn from others from the past. And so it was a resurgence of the intellect and of thinking. Out of the Renaissance, you enter into this era of the Enlightenment. For a lot of people, they think of the Enlightenment as contrary to Christianity. Christianity, you have the Enlightenment. Conservative, you have liberal. No. The Enlightenment actually was birthed by Christians. So for a long time, it stayed faithful to Christianity. It was just Christians who were saying, I don't want to kill people over my faith anymore. I want to think about my faith, and I want to challenge others to think about what they believe and not just receive it because the king tells them to. So it began as a very Christian thing. It will end up not a very Christian thing because in holding up reason, eventually they're going to let go of revelation, and it's only going to be about reason. So where does the Enlightenment come from? Well, some people actually place it not in philosophy, but science, like Isaac Newton really is the father of Enlightenment ideas. But the people who really clarified what the Enlightenment is are philosophers. And so I'm going to walk you through a few of them. This is getting a little technical for a moment. I hope I don't lose you, but this is really fascinating. I'm about to talk to you about 4 philosophers and some of the stuff that they hold, and a lot of it's going to sound really foreign to you. The challenge is actually your whole way of looking at life is dependent on these 4 guys. You may not even know their names, but the way you think about reality and your place in the universe is built on what they came up with. So you should know them. First, Descartes. So René Descartes is the guy who famously said, I think, therefore I am. He's the father of that idea. He was a Christian, faithful Christian, so he wasn't trying to walk away from Christianity. But we say, I think, therefore I am. You probably heard that before. That's radical. Why is that radical? Because before Descartes, I am based on what? Because God said. I am because God said. Well, the problem is, if you're a Christian, then you are because Yahweh said. If you're a Muslim, you are because Yahweh. If you're a Muslim, then you are because Allah said. Your gods are different. Your basis of reality is different. And so you end up killing one another over that. Descartes comes along and says, well, ultimately, when you decide to follow the Bible, how are you doing that? Because your mind thought about it. And you walked through a series of doubts and of thoughts and arrived at the conclusion that you exist and that the best explanation of your existence is the Bible. And so you're arriving at your faith through your thinking. And so rather than killing people who disagree with us, let's just think this out. Let's think through what we believe. So it's a radical idea. In other words, your existence as a human is not predicated on your king telling you exist because the Bible says. It's because you thought it through. And you said, this is what I believe. This is why I believe it. So radical idea that Descartes comes up with. He's the father of a lot of Enlightenment philosophy. Next guy, John Locke in England. He pioneered this idea of religious tolerance that we've been thinking about. Before John Locke, that was kind of a foreign concept. He's the guy who comes along, again, faithful Christian, but said, we need to give people the freedom to believe what they want to believe. He's the guy who came up with a lot of the modern political theories that you hold to. So the idea that the person who rules only rules through the consent of the governed. That's John Locke. That's him saying, hey, we as autonomous humans made in the image of God, he founded a lot of his philosophy in theology, we should have the right to decide who rules over us. So a lot of that came from John Locke. When we talk about empiricism, I don't know if you know what that word means. It means that knowledge comes primarily through the senses. What he's saying is that everything that you know to be true, it's because you've seen it or you heard it or you touched it, you feel it. That's how knowledge comes to you. And so he's talking about how do we know what we know. So again, a faithful Christian, but who's helping us to think about how we think and how we know things. Next guy, David Hume, also in England. He may not have been a Christian. He pioneered what we call skepticism. So you're going to doubt everything. You're going to doubt that one thing leads to another. And naturalism, the idea that ultimately everything can be explained through the natural world and natural causes. All three of these guys were pioneers in their field, but the fourth guy is the biggest of them all. He's the guy that really our conception of reality in the Western world is built on. It's Immanuel Kant. So Kant, brilliant guy. There's a lot of things that Kant thought through and wrote about, so I'm not coming anywhere close to doing him justice. I'm going to just try to give you one particular idea that he came up with that had an incredibly radical effect upon religion in the Western world. Kant divided all things into two groups. So everything that you claim to know, he divided into two groups, the phenomena and the noumena. And the phenomena is those things that you experience. So it's stuff you know because you touched it and you tested it and you saw it and you heard it and you tasted it. And he says those things you can truly claim to know because you observe them. So think scientific method here. It's kind of the background to it. You're testing it, you're feeling it, you're sensing it. And then you have the noumena. These are things that you can't experience. They're things that are out there. They're ultimately things that you can't know. He talked about the idea of the thing that exists in and of itself. You can't know that. It's separate from you. You can't touch it. You can't test it. And so by dividing all things that could be known into the things you experience and the things as they are in themselves, well, where do you think religion belongs? Where's God? Where's Jesus? Where's the resurrection? None of it's phenomena. None of it's stuff you can test. You can't go test the resurrection. You can't go test God. So that all belonged up here. Now, interestingly, Kant, as best we can tell, was at least nominally a Christian. He still believed in God, but he carved all religious thought off and placed it over here into the world that you can't know. Now, this was important and radical because what it means is that I don't get to kill you over your religious beliefs because ultimately neither of us know, right? We can fight over phenomena because we can test it. We can observe it. But the noumena that's out there, we can't know for sure. It's a matter of faith. All we can do is believe. And so he's the one that came up with this idea of distinguishing between religious truths which you believe and scientific truths which you prove and test. Okay, so really radical way that he divided all of knowledge into those two groups. Now, I know all that philosophy gets pretty complicated. The key is that how you perceive the world is built on what these guys came up with. The things that you just commonly take for granted and that everyone in our society does, this is where it came from. Before this, no one had these ideas. No one's walking around believing, hey, I don't get to kill you for what you believe in religion. No one's thinking, hey, maybe I don't know that God exists. Maybe it's a matter of faith and I can't prove it. That's all built on what these guys came up with. There's a lot of good that came out of this. There's a lot actually here up on the board that we agree with. I agree with Descartes. I think, therefore, I am. Ultimately, how do I know that the Bible is true? Why do I believe the Bible? Because I think about it. Ultimately, I doubt it and I think about it and I try to figure out why I believe it. I'm involved. I'm not just told by my king, believe it or die, right? So I agree with him about that. I agree with John Locke on the idea of religious tolerance. I think Immanuel Kant is getting to some good things. I actually am very vocal with people that I don't know that we're right about Christianity, right? Because it's a faith. It's not a sight. It's not a proof. I can't prove Jesus. In the medieval era, that was not acceptable to say that. But we don't live there. We live based on So I don't know that Jesus rose from the dead. I believe he rose from the dead. I can look back to Kant as the guy who figured out that distinction. Right? So now let's get a little more practical. You can turn your page over. Okay, so I told you we're covering a lot tonight. All right. Now that we have finally gotten to the Enlightenment, we have introduced you to the second major worldview that is present in your community, among people that you go to work with and live next to and shop next to and do your hobbies with. We talked last week about the first worldview, the worldview of revelation, that believes that ultimate truth is revealed by God. And so this is when you're sharing your faith to a practicing Muslim or a practicing Hindu. You both hold to the revelation worldview, that God revealed himself. And so what you're talking about is whether your God is more realistic to believe in or our God is more realistic to believe in. Now we're talking about a second worldview, this idea of reason. So the reason worldview, it says that ultimate truth is found in human reason and scientific progress. And the key there, when you look at this, I'm not saying that reason is bad. I hope you are reasonable. I hope you use your reason. What we're saying when we say that we're talking to somebody who holds the reason worldview that we're sharing our faith with, the key word there is ultimate, the word ultimate. So we hold that science is good. We hold that human reasoning is good. But what we say is that we believe that ultimate truth is found in Scripture, handed down, revelation handed down by God. Someone who holds the reason worldview will not agree with that. They will say, no, ultimate truth is what you discover through science. Okay? You live in a town with a lot of those folks, right? University town, you're going to have a ton of people living in the reason worldview. So what we're talking about is how you share your faith with somebody who's not a Christian, who holds to the reason worldview. They believe that ultimate truth is found in their human intellect and their reasoning ability through the scientific method, through historical pursuits, whatever that might be. How do you share your faith with them? I'm going to walk you through some basic steps here. The first one is you should know why you believe what you believe. So I hope that you're not still living in the medieval era. You believe what you believe because somebody in power told you to. Don't do that. Believe what you believe because you've thought about it. And you have arrived at the conclusion that Christianity is the best explanation of the universe as you perceive it. So get into the arguments for Christianity. Why do you believe what you believe? And there's a lot of great resources out there if you want to study your faith, like why is it reasonable to believe in Christianity? Notice how I phrase that. We're not studying why Christianity is proven true. We can't prove it true. All we can do is declare that it's reasonable to believe. So great resources out there. You get a lot of famous ones. More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell. Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. Reasons for God by Timothy Keller is really good. We actually have an article on our website under the FAQ section that's evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. That's the one for me. Actually, the reason that I'm Christian above all other things is because of the historical evidence for the actual bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. There's a lot about Christianity that I don't understand, that I can't put together. There's even parts that I don't like, but I hold to Christianity because, based on historical evidence, I've concluded Jesus really rose from the dead. I think it's more reasonable to believe he rose from the dead than he didn't. So if you want to get into historical evidence, like why do you believe that, Blake? It's online. Go to the FAQs and you'll see evidence for the resurrection. So read and study that stuff so that you have an idea of what are you going to say when someone asks you why are you a Christian? Especially as it gets harder to be a Christian in our culture and somebody's going to think, what kind of doofus are you that believes in Christianity? You need to have an answer to that. So what has led you to believe that the story of Christianity is actually true? So that's the first step, know why you believe. Second step, exude humility. That one is so important. Remember, in the medieval era and even in the Reformation, there was no humility. There was just murder. There was just death. I am right, you are wrong, so I have the right to kill you. The Enlightenment helped us to step back from that and say, wait a minute, no, maybe we're not right. Maybe we need to both get to speak in this conversation. People are often fascinated here. In conversations that I've had with people who are not believers, not Christians, often atheists or agnostics, two of the most helpful things that I've said in those conversations are, I don't know, and I totally could be wrong. I'll say that in every conversation. I'll say that before I share my belief. Because I want them to know, I don't have any claim to God that they don't have. I haven't been to the seventh heaven and seen God. No, it's a matter of faith. I believe it, but I could totally be wrong. That's how faith works. You realize that. You're believing that something is true. You can't prove that it's true. So by exuding humility in that conversation, you open them to talk. Okay, so never walk into a conversation with the goal of proving that they're wrong. That's kind of the Facebook way. I saw on Facebook comment walls. Let's prove that you're wrong and I'm right. That's useless. That's worse than useless. You've actually shut down the chance to share the gospel if you come across as knowing that you're right. No one knows that they're right, not till we die, right? So exude humility. Open the conversation. I totally could be wrong, but this is why I've chosen to believe, right? So, exude humility. Third step, address the heart, not just the head. What we're trying to get at there, probably the biggest failing of the reason worldview is that it believes that if you can just think through everything, life will be perfect. I hope you all are intelligent enough to know that that's not the case. You're not just a mind on legs. You have a heart. You have emotions and you have relationships and you experience things and just knowing everything doesn't suddenly make the world an infinitely better place. It's interesting, the reason worldview will win the day until an era that we'll talk about next week, the postmodern worldview, I'm curious if you have any, what brought an end to the reason or Enlightenment worldview and brought about the postmodern worldview? There's a world event, World War II, and particularly the Holocaust and the dropping of the nuclear bomb. Because who did that? Holocaust? That's Germany, the most intellectually brilliant nation on earth. Where did their intellect lead them? To genocide. And we as Americans, I'm not saying that it was wrong to drop the bomb, that's not at all the conversation, but where did that intellect go? Into a device that could kill millions at the same time. And suddenly people woke up and said, maybe reason isn't that great after all. Okay, so there's still a lot of people in our town who hold wisdom, hold reason, scientific progress as the ultimate good. When you're interacting with someone like that, remember, whether they will admit it or not, we are not just brains on legs, we have a heart. And you can engage that. And so when I talk to people who hold the reason worldview, I find that often the most powerful thing I can do is find some way in the conversation to turn it to the heart and to talk about the peace and joy that I experience through my relationship with Jesus. Because ultimately, science isn't going to ever produce that. Science can't give you peace and joy at an ultimate level. Okay, so when you can turn it to the heart, that can be very powerful. We'll talk next week some about doing that through stories. Fourth and final step, was there last week. I guess maybe I'll put it on all 3 weeks. It's a really good one. Care for the vulnerable. Ultimately, that's what separates Christianity from every other religion on earth, I would argue, is that when we're following our master, when we're following our God, we care sacrificially and selflessly for the most vulnerable. When you do that, you confound reason. It is actually fascinating. Again, go back to World War II, go back to the Nazis and the genocide. Why did they do that? What was their basic belief about the people that they were killing? You are weak, and so we need to remove you from the gene pool, right? What are we saying? You are weak, so we need to lift you up above everyone else. Radically different. So reason argues for the first. When you come alongside an orphan and care for that orphan, that's not reasonable. How is that benefiting you? How is that survival of the fittest? You're going against reason. But that is an incredible testimony. Because again, people who claim reason is better, they still would say the Nazis were wrong, right? Because they have a heart. And they said, that's wrong. Doesn't matter how reasonable it is from the standpoint of genetics, it was wrong. Okay, connect with that. Yeah, we're the ones who say, let's take the weakest and most vulnerable in the world and lift them above everybody else. Okay, so when you do that, that's a powerful testimony to people living in that reason worldview, because reason can't explain why God, who is the strongest of all, would become the weakest and the sacrifice. Okay, so model that, live that out. We've covered a lot tonight. It's 8:40. I think I'm supposed to stop now. So just to remind you guys what you need to do. So if you have questions, I'm glad you have questions. Remember, you can email them to questions@grace-bible.org. We'll answer them on video and then post it whenever it's posted. The questions from last week should be uploaded probably by some point tonight, for sure tomorrow. You can get them on YouTube. Oh, they're up now. So they're on our YouTube channel and on our app. They'll be on our website tomorrow or the day after. I'll see you guys next week, and we'll finish the modern era, move into the postmodern era. It should be a lot of fun. See you then.
Right.